So to get started on the presentation, so this event today, we have an hour and we've got a lot planned, but we are hoping you'll come away from it with a sense of what's happening around community-owned green space in Glasgow and the Clyde Valley. The agenda, as we've said, there's a bit of a welcome. We've got ourselves from Community Land Scotland here, as well as David from COSS here providing the presentations. There'll be the breakout session. The breakout session, one topic is going to be on community gardens and growing, which will be Heather and David, and the other topic will be community woodlands, parks, and other green spaces. So, and I'll take that, and you'll be able to pick which breakout room you want to go into. So when David's presentation ends, we'll go ahead and go into those breakout rooms. And any questions we can pick up through the breakout rooms or separately via the chat, or just get in touch with us if you have a question later. So you'll be asked to join a breakout room and be able to pick that for yourself after the presentations. And then we'll all come back together for feedback and next steps. And we've talked about the IT and the event guidelines. So we're going to give an overview of the routes to ownership, to community ownership, and then provide discussion and hopefully identify some next steps and come out of this with a bit of momentum about where things are going. This event follows on an event that Community Land Scotland had last week, which was titled Meet the Pioneers, Community Ownership of Urban Green Space, which went through 3 experiences of community ownership of urban green space, one of which is Bonnie Muir Green Community Trust, whose experience of taking ownership of a bowling green I've highlighted here. It's a picture from the start of their process, which resonated with me because many of the community buildings in Glasgow bear too much resemblance to this photo at the minute. So definitely have a watch of that if you haven't already, and I'll be talking about it a little bit. But we wanted to take the opportunity to go deeper because those videos and presentations on people's experiences are a great resource to understand different processes and get inspiration, but also there's not much time for discussion. And if you're going to that type of event and you're starting out on an ownership process, you might have a lot of questions about the technicalities being mentioned by the presenters. So today we're going to focus on ownership and how that works for green space. And I suppose the starting point for Community Land Scotland, and I'll talk a little bit more about where we come to this from, but there's a lot of support for creating community green space projects. Some of them are grassroots, like this example I've put up from Glasgow Live about residents just getting stuck into creating communal green space. There's lots of council support programs like the Stalled Spaces program, which maybe some of you are aware of. There's vacant and derelict land funding. There's a lot of funding coming around about climate change and COP26, and there's lots of other topics. So there's lots of funding for greening, for green spaces of all types. But what we're particularly interested in, and what we're talking about today, is taking that short to medium term, let's say, investment of effort and the benefits of creating that green space and turning it into long-term community buyouts. So taking these temporary projects and where it's appropriate, where the community really wants to do it, providing that route to permanent community ownership. And this is what Community Scotland's perspective is. This is what we're bringing to urban community land ownership. We're the voice of Scotland's community landowners. We were set up around 11 years ago now by some of the individuals in the photo here who were involved in the first buyouts in the Highlands and Islands, who felt that the momentum behind land reform and community ownership wasn't going quickly enough. And they also felt strongly that all communities across Scotland should be benefiting from land reform and community ownership, which at that point was only available in the Highlands and Islands. So we see land reform and community ownership as central to transforming Scotland to a more sustainable society. So as part of the work of Community Land Scotland, we've set up a hub based on Glasgow and the Clyde Valley. We've just been up and running a few months now. The aim of the project is encouraging and enabling more community ownership in this particular area through increased support to groups, through action research on some topics, and promoting land reform. We've got a development officer, which is Heather. We've got some resources to address particular challenges around community ownership, and a manager, which is me. I don't want to get into too much detail about this. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly, and if you have questions, just get in touch. But we've got different support for groups. We've got development officer support. We've got this funding for enhanced support around challenges for community ownership. And we specialize in community ownership of privately held land and assets, because that's the history of Community Land Scotland, working in those large buyouts of private estates in the Highlands and Islands. We do a lot of work signposting to the wide range of organizations that can support community ownership. There's so many different types of community ownership projects, there's a great deal of different types of support. We signposted DTAS' great work about Community Ownership Support Service, which David is going to explain to you. And there's lots of other groups that are listed here. Community Woodlands Association is a key one there, but there's lots more. So get in touch and we can talk you through all of that. Briefly on our action research work, so it's important for us to be supporting groups, but also making things easier for groups, driving forward land reform. So we're doing work around how to make community ownership more diverse and inclusive. How can we support community ownership and community owners in engaging vacant and derelict land work? And also, how can we bring planning and land reform closer together? What are the ways we can make that easier for everyone? Two systems that are quite a lot in common. We do a lot of work around influencing policy and legislation. There's a new Land Reform Act coming in the new Parliament because that's in the S&P manifestos, so we're expecting that. The land fund has been doubled in the new government as part of the manifesto work, which we've been heavily involved in, and that's a doubling. It was 10 million annually, and it's going up to 20 million by the end of the new Parliament. All signs point to that happening, which is really great. And there's talk about improvement of the legal routes to community ownership. So that hopefully is more than you wanted to know about us and what we're doing here. So the question is, where are we community ownership in 2019? Well, there's 590 assets owned by community groups, well over 400 community groups owning those assets all across Scotland. And the type of assets communities own varies dramatically. So it's pretty much, if you can think of it, a community probably has tried to build it. We've got spaceports, we've got harbors, we've got ferries, housing, and energy, and of course, lots of different types of green space. So how do you get to this point of owning the asset that 418 groups have done? What are the steps? Well, simplistically, starting at the beginning, there's three main routes to community ownership. There's negotiated sales with a private landowner, where a community group goes to the private landowner and seeks to buy the land. Same like you would buy a house or any other type of asset. And there's also then two legal rights. There's a community's rights to buy, and I've listed three here on the sides. We won't be getting that into any detail today, but we can separately pick up that point, and David will be able to pick up that as well. And then there's asset transfer from public bodies, which is what COSS is absolutely brilliant at supporting groups around. In particular, they do lots of other things, but asset transfer is very much their bag, and we'll be hearing more about that soon. So again, different routes to ownership. And we all think it's quite interesting because there's three different routes, but the most common is private negotiated sale. So ultimately, communities have rights to buy and to get assets transferred from public bodies, but the most common is at the end of that process, possibly of seeking out those different types of legal routes, can often be a negotiated sale, which was the case of, for example, Helensburgh Woodland, which was on the video last week, where they tried to exercise their community right to buy, but in the end just bought directly with the landowner. So how does this work then? The basic community ownership model is that you set up a community body, which is going to have open membership to absolutely anyone, should be nonprofit distributing. There's going to need to be some evidence of community support for the project. And I've put a screenshot here of an engagement that Carluke High Mill is doing, who was one of the presenters last week. That's on the website now. So you can see how they're going about doing that community engagement. You need to have a business plan for how you're going to implement your project. And the last piece of it is that there's a requirement for the Scottish Land Fund and Community Right to Buy for a geographic community to be defined that is supporting this project. And I can explain more about communities of geography, the theory behind it, if people are interested. But it presents a bit of a challenge around urban green space. So I wanted to walk through that. So the Scottish Land Fund and Community Rights to Buy require geographic community definition, and they have different requirements depending on what you're doing, which your support workers could sort of talk you through all of that. Now, community groups which aren't geographic can of course own property. Lots do and have done for a very long time. But the supports under land reform are limited to geographic communities. Asset transfer from public bodies doesn't require communities of geography, which David is going to clarify. So we're getting to technicalities here. So you need to think about where the owner is and where you're going with things to understand if you need to do this community of geography point, which we can discuss more. Now, a group with a particular interest which we call communities of interest and sort of the land reform world and community ownership world, can become a community of geography. So on the one hand, a community that's coming together to do an urban green space project would be a community of interest, simply thinking that through, but actually in practice, it's quite straightforward. And in many cases, those people who are coming together around one common interest can easily become a community of geography to tap into the supports under land reform. It's getting technical already, I'm sorry everyone. So here's some examples around how green space groups have become geographic communities from the groups that presented at the video last week. And I won't go through these in detail, but you can see there's a vision around becoming an urban community-led green space and social hub for everyone from Barney Muir Green. Carluke is quite similar, nonprofit, carrying out projects to develop community space and the environment in a particular area, in that case, the parish of Carluke. And Helensborough Community Woodland is managing local woodlands for community benefit. That's quite a simple description of what they do, and it complies with that technical legislation, or that technical requirement around communities of geography. So examples there and something to be aware of as you move forward. So getting into technicalities now around community ownership. If you've got a site, first point, these are sort of the 5 points, and we can send materials on this, and COSS will have materials too. There's lots of things we can send you that explain this. So I've done my rehash of it here as well, which is the first thing to do if you're interested in community ownership is understanding who owns it, research the existing owners, because that's going to set up lots of questions around where you go, what's the next route to community ownership, who you need to speak to. Maybe you don't know who owns it yet, so you're not sure who to speak to. Well, I think the community land world is actually quite small. We're always happy to help people and point them in the right direction. So who owns it? Researching the existing owners. The Registers of Scotland is the first place to start with that, and we can provide all these links. Easily done. How are you going to buy it? So you understand that you have an idea who you think the owner is. There's probably a route to ownership at that point. Is it held by a public body, or is it held by a private landowner? Which private landowner? You're starting to think about which route to ownership maybe you'd be interested in proceeding for yourself. What are you going to do when you own it is something you need to be thinking about from the beginning. From an urban green space perspective, you probably have a good idea about that. So that's helpful. How are you going to be organized? So the requirements for the land fund and the community right to buy have requirements around governance, which I've listed here. And again, there's technicalities around that. But it's good to start thinking about that from the beginning, because you're going to need to set up a community body that can take on land under the Scottish legal system. So in many cases, this requires setting up a different type of organization than you would have maybe had before, whether it's a community council or maybe it's a group of interest just narrowly focused around a particular interest. You need to set up a development trust, for example. So going through that process, start thinking about, do we have the right kind of organization? And if we need a different type of organization, what one do we want? And then start thinking about the funding is sort of the fifth key point at the earliest stages. The Scottish Land Fund exists. And they have great advisors that will be able to answer questions at the earliest stages. And they have support for development, so feasibility studies and business plans and those kinds of things, as well as purchase costs. And then you need to start thinking about capital costs and maintenance and revenues, which is a challenge for urban green space. And then there's also lots of emerging opportunities around funding, particularly green space opportunities that seem to come out. There was one announced yesterday called the Nature Restoration Fund, which includes capital costs for urban green space. So starting to get your head around all that is quite important. So what are some of the challenges? And you're going to know better than me, and this is where I look forward to the discussions. But from working with groups, things that come up quite quickly and quite commonly are questions about land ownership information. You think you know it, if you're looking in the right place. Is the information straightforward? It's often not straightforward. It's usually more complicated than you expected. And then even when you do know the owners, or you think you know the owners, there's a series of other challenges that arise around ownership. A lot of ownerless land in urban areas, and green space is quite often on ownerless land already because it's ownerless and maybe nothing's happening with the land. So there's possibly an association there between green space and ownerless land being more common. There's different experiences with public bodies and which public body is holding it, which are questions around asset transfer. There are some challenges around community right to buy process and how that is going to work for groups. And then the final point around landowners is landowners have rights and responsibilities under Scottish land reform and the Scottish Land Commission's work around that. So there's a series of there's protocols for engaging with landowners and challenges and supports that are in place to help challenges in engaging with landowners. In terms of urban green space and ownership challenges, you know, dereliction and vacant land is a huge challenge in urban Scotland and in Glasgow and the Clyde Valley, obviously. But with that vacant and derelict land, there become costs associated with just land contamination, dereliction, and fixing derelict buildings, and all of those challenges that urban green space groups thinking to take them on will need to understand. What is really this land that we're taking on? What is it going to take to remediate it and make it good for communities, et cetera? And then a final point that I wanted to highlight is around revenue. So revenue is a challenge for green space groups because there's not an inherent business model in terms of selling something like it was a community shop, then you have a revenue model to be able to apply. But with green space, that's not necessarily always what happens. And if you watch the video from Meet the Pioneers of Green Space, to talk quite a lot about the revenue challenges, those groups, which is very useful. So then picking up on opportunities, we talked about the challenges. There's only 5. There's actually quite a lot more. Those are my top 5. But let's focus on the opportunities. So there's support networks around this route to ownership. There's ourselves. There's DTAS COSS. There's a Community Woodlands Association. There's lots of others as well. I mean, that support includes government funding for this, which is doubling by the end of the next parliament. There's political will behind it. So you can tap into this momentum to build your projects. There's inspiration from the pioneers. You can take inspiration and you can take direct advice from the groups that have done this before, which is a great resource. Absolutely. There's a huge opportunity in believing in your project and believing in land reform. So many of these projects are quite aspirational, and that's what makes them exciting. And that's a huge opportunity. We're doing something that's challenging but worthwhile. And green space projects will be central to responding to COVID and climate change. I mean, some of this, I think, you know, we know quite well, and just to repeat it at this point, you know, community organizations have proven themselves in providing support for communities under COVID-19 and doing all sorts of things that government bodies weren't able to do during the emergency situation. And COVID-19 has also shown the importance of urban green space and the inequalities in access and how important that is. Similarly, climate change, community owners are really effective at climate change projects, adaptation and mitigation projects. Community Land Scotland published a report on this earlier this year, which has demonstrated this really well. But community owners, because they're open, democratically accountable, doing community-led projects, they know what their communities need, and they're putting in place really innovative projects that meet the requirements of climate change. And they've been doing this for quite some time in many cases. So there's huge challenges, but there's also huge opportunities for urban green space projects in addressing what we're going to do as we move forward as a society in Scotland around land use. So this is the importance of the big picture. And I wanted to finish with this point, because I know I started with quite a lot of technical sort of content around tips and tricks and where to start with community ownership. You know, the people on this call are going to be central. I hope, I aspire to community supported and owned green space and climate projects in the future in Glasgow. So think about the big picture, draw inspiration from what's going on. It's a long, hard journey, but that's the work of shifting power over land to communities. That's the experience of the members of Community Land Scotland, is the long, hard journey of doing that work. And we were recently had a meeting where the staff of Community Land Scotland were asked to think radically and fearlessly about land reform moving forward. I can see Heather smiling. So I thought I would pass that on to yourselves as well, because that's the ethos of where we're approaching this, because it can be challenging, but it's so beneficial. So I will turn over to David at that point. Apologies probably for slightly overrunning, David.
That's okay. Excuse me. Hello, nice to see you all. I recognise a few of the names there, which is always very nice. I think there's something really exciting happening in terms of community growing projects right now. I think with a lockdown, I think what we're seeing is a lot of groups who are coming forward saying, we were really active during lockdown and we want to do more, and how do we do that? And I think one of my first sort of visits back to the real world after lockdown was to go and see the concrete garden in the heart of Glasgow. And that was really nice beautiful space, and I think what they're doing is really impressive. So thanks to Carey and Heather for inviting me along. I appreciate that. Carey told me to stick to 5 slides and 10 minutes. I managed to do it in 10 slides, but I will take no more than 10 minutes, I do promise. So, yeah, you can just hook me if I'm going on too long. So let me just share my screen with you. Right. Can you all see that okay? Just maybe stick your thumbs up if you can see. Right, thanks so much. So routes to ownership. I was asked to sort of talk a bit about the community ownership support service and some of the things that we do. So the Community Ownership Support Service, or COSS, is a Scottish Government funded service. We cover the whole of Scotland. We have advisors in cover the whole of Scotland. I cover Glasgow and the West Coast. It's a free service, and we work both with community groups, and we work also with the public sector that own the assets that groups are interested in making use of. So we work with both sides really. And I think what's been happening over lockdown has been quite interesting in that we've moved a lot of our services online. A lot of the information that we provide is online. We have a training program that covers both community groups and public authorities now, which takes people from the process of just an idea that you might have about an asset, how you want to use it, all the way through to sort of negotiating the transfer of that asset and how you then go on to use it. So, and all the stages in between. So I tried to cover that in those presentations. Carey asked me to touch upon the SULU team, or the Scottish Universities Land Unit, which my colleague Elspeth, our legal advisor, is a sort of coordinator for. And established in 2018, the purpose was to encourage law students to take more interest in community ownership type issues. And it's gone great guns, really. So those 4 universities on your right-hand side of the page are the ones that are involved. And it doesn't allow you to do property searches or title searches as such. That's not quite its function, but it's around allowing students to try and tackle some of the issues associated with title, some of the burdens, some of the obstacles that might be in your way. So if there are any kind of interesting questions, legal questions around property and title that arise for you in your journey, feel free to get in touch and have a chat. And if we can frame it as a question, perhaps we can involve some of the students in that. And there's a link in the presentation there to one of the fact sheets that came out of that on detrimental land. So when you get the slides, you can look at that. So what does COSS do then? Much of our work emanates from the 2015 Community Empowerment Act, and in particular, the parts of the Act which are around community influence and community control. In particular, Part 5, which is about community asset transfer. And I'll talk about what that means in just a moment or two. We also get involved in a degree, early stages, before handing on groups who might be interested in community right to buy, and also some of the new legislation, some of the new acts around vacant derelict land and sustainable development. So we might have some early conversations with groups around assets owned by the private sector. And in that case, we would work with you to a point and hand you over to the Scottish Government team that deals with that. I think because Carey and their team are now here in Glasgow, I would sort of work with them to hand on groups who are interested in privately owned assets. So that's what we do. What is community asset transfer then? So just to kind of deal with the jargon, sometimes referred to as a CAT, community asset transfer. It's a process to allow a community organisation to take over a publicly owned land or building in a way that recognises the public benefits that the community use will bring. And the transfer can be, about outright ownership, or it can be around a lease, or it could be around a management agreement. So people often assume that we only work with groups who are interested in community ownership outright, but actually know, probably the majority of the cases we work with are groups looking for long-term leases. And there is, and I'll touch upon this, I think an interesting relationship between leases and ownership anyway, that I think people are starting to become more aware of. The assets can be transferred at a discounted price, whether it's a rent or transfer value, based upon the community benefit that you're producing. And I think one of the interesting things about community growing groups is that the community benefits are really strong and getting better understood as time goes by. So that's a definite strength. Just to say, talking about the community rights that you get under community asset transfer, what do they actually mean? So essentially, these are the key ones. There's a right, you can request as much information as you want about an asset from a public authority. And generally, what I will do with the group is encourage them at the outset to ask questions about running costs, about the condition of the land, what's known about the land, whether there's any restrictions on access or burdens in the title, these kinds of questions. So the more forewarned you are on your journey, the easier it becomes, although it never is that easy, to be honest. A group can request the transfer of a publicly owned asset, regardless of whether the public authority has it on a sort of surplus list or not. And that's one of the big differences. So if you know of something or identify something that is publicly owned in your community and you think that will be a good home for your community growing activities, then you've got a right to seek the transfer of that asset. It doesn't have to be on a surplus list. There is an assumption built into the process that if you put a case together, you will be successful. And there needs to be good reasons for the public authority to say why you won't get that land. And I think the important thing is there that it's a transparent process. So it's all visible online. And I think any public authority that says no or imposes restrictive conditions has to explain that openly and can be challenged in that too. So that kind of changes the whole ethos of the process just a little bit. You decide what you want to offer in terms of the rent or the value based upon the social benefits you produce. No guarantee that the authority will accept that. There might be a degree of negotiation, but you can make that offer, and that's important. And if you think things have gone wrong, there is a right to seek a review or an appeal. And again, that just changes the power balance a little bit in this process in your favour. So those are the key rights. I wanted just to touch upon eligibility issues. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail. To be eligible to use the Act for leasing or managing an asset, you need to be a community controlled body. So essentially what that means is that in your constitution, there needs to be a requirement that your membership is in control, really. You're open to any member of your community to join. But the key thing is that the community is in control, both in terms of the membership and also on the board itself or your management committee, that you can show that the members are always in control. So that's the key thing there, really. And I think the interesting thing about leases, for those of you that are interested in a lease or a management agreement, is that the community asset transfer rights give you a chance to say what you would like to see in terms of a lease. So previously you may have been offered a lease that would have been fairly standard in terms of the terms, and it may or may not have suited you. But I think through the legislation, it gives you scope to actually push for things that you want. So I encourage groups to try and identify early on what suits you in terms of some of these questions, you know, length of tenure. Do you want the flexibility to make adaptations if it's a building? Do you want to sublet? All these kinds of questions. And the more you express them and identify them at the outset, the more likely it is that you will end up with a lease that actually suits you as an organisation. If you want to seek ownership of an asset, outright ownership, then again, you need to be a community controlled body, but you also need to be incorporated as one of these three models here. So a Scottish charitable incorporation organisation of scale, a community benefit society, which is perhaps the least well known of the models, And if you're interested in a community shares issue as part of the funding package for your plans, then the Community Benefit Society is the model that you would be looking at. And also a company limited by guarantee, which can often be the simplest one to set up. So you've got to be one of those three prescribed models if you want to use the Act to seek ownership. And so one of the things I quite often do with groups early stage is look at your constitution and make sure that it's fit or allows you to do what you want to do, whether it's leasing or ownership. This is the guide that I use when I'm working with groups. Quite often I'm basically cutting and pasting or trying to explain some of the content in this guide. It's freely accessible to anybody. Again, if Heather's going to send out the slides, I've made sure that there's a link to that there. But that's really all I wanted to cover with you. I think the key thing from my point of view is that if groups are interested in this, feel free to get in touch. Those are my contact details. I'm happy to speak to groups at any stage and try and support you on your journey. And I think that's really all I need to say to you, or all I want to say to you for the time being. Hopefully that's within the 10 minutes. Thank you.